It is 7:43 in the evening on January 18, 2026, and somewhere in the Spanish countryside near a town called Adamuz, a high-speed train is hurtling through the dark at about 200 kilometers per hour, and the 289 passengers on board have absolutely no idea that in roughly 9 seconds, the rear 3 carriages of their train are going to rip themselves off the tracks and swing directly into the path of another train coming from the opposite direction. 9 seconds from now, 2 trains are going to collide on what Spanish authorities will later describe as one of the safest stretches of high-speed rail in the entire country, a straight section of track with no curves, no switches, no complicated geometry, just a clean line through the Andalusian hills that had been completely renovated 8 months earlier as part of a €700 million investment program. 9 seconds from now, 46 people are going to lose their lives on a piece of infrastructure that was supposedly in perfect condition. And here is where this story starts to fall apart, in ways that still have investigators scratching their heads 2 months later. The train that derailed was an Iryo service, one of the sleek private operators that began running on Spain's high-speed network a few years back. This particular train set had been built in 2022, which made it practically brand new by railway standards, and it had passed its last safety inspection just 3 days before the crash on January 15th. The driver was doing everything right, traveling well under the speed limit for that section. There was nothing unusual about the journey until the rear carriages suddenly lurched to the right, left the rails, and then swung left across the tracks into the path of a southbound Renfe service carrying 184 passengers from Madrid to Huelva. The collision was so violent that bodies were found hundreds of meters from the crash site. The first 2 carriages of the Renfe train were knocked clean off the embankment and tumbled 4 meters down the slope. Now you might be thinking that something catastrophic must have happened to cause this kind of disaster, some massive failure that nobody could have predicted. But when investigators started picking through the wreckage and examining the track, what they found was almost laughably small compared to the devastation it caused. A rail break, 40 centimeters long, roughly the length of your forearm, at a spot where 2 sections of rail had been joined together using a process called aluminothermic welding. One of those rail sections had been manufactured in 2023 and installed during the renovation work in May 2025, and it had been welded to an older section of rail that dated back to 1989. 36 years of age difference between 2 pieces of steel that were supposed to work together seamlessly, and somewhere in that joint, something went wrong. The really troubling part is that this section of track had been tested 3 times in the months before the crash. Once in September with dynamic acoustic testing, again in October with the same method, and a 3rd time in November using ultrasonic equipment. None of those tests picked up anything that suggested this weld was developing a problem. 3 separate inspections on a stretch of track that was part of a major investment program. And somehow, the fault that would eventually tear open and claim 46 lives managed to slip through every single one of them. But here is where the story takes a turn that makes you want to put your head in your hands. People had been raising complaints about this exact section of track for months before the crash. Back in August 2025, 5 months before that evening in Adamuz, the Spanish train drivers union SEMAF sent a formal letter to the National Rail Infrastructure Manager, ADIF. They also sent copies to the State Railway Safety Agency and to the Transport Minister. In that letter, they laid out a long, detailed list of concerns about what drivers were experiencing on the high-speed lines in the region. Drivers reported abnormal vibrations at full speed, bumps and potholes in the track surface, instability that was causing premature wear on the trains, and frequent breakdowns that were disrupting service. They specifically mentioned the Madrid to Andalusia corridor, the exact route where the Adamuz crash would later happen, and they asked that speed restrictions be imposed on the affected sections until the problems could be properly investigated and fixed. According to everything that has come out since the crash, nothing was done. No speed restrictions were imposed. No emergency inspections were ordered. No follow-up investigations were launched to find what was causing the vibrations and the bumps drivers were reporting. The union sent their warning, and 5 months later, 2 trains collided on a supposedly perfect stretch of track, and 46 families had to be told that their loved ones were never coming home. Transport Minister Oscar Puente called the crash tremendously strange, and you could hear the confusion in his voice when he talked about it, because on paper, this should never have happened. This was a straight section of track, no curves to negotiate, no complex junctions, just a clean run through open countryside on rails that had been laid down less than a year earlier. The Iryo train was practically new, built in 2022 and passing inspection 3 days before, and the driver was operating well within the speed limits. Everything that was supposed to prevent this kind of disaster was in place, and yet 46 people still lost their lives because a 40-centimeter section of rail decided to give way at exactly the wrong moment. 2 days after Adamuz, another train crashed in Spain, this time near Barcelona when a commuter service slammed into a retaining wall that had collapsed onto the tracks during heavy rainfall from Storm Harry. That crash claimed the life of a trainee driver and injured 37 passengers. Suddenly, SEMAF was no longer just writing letters. They were calling for a nationwide strike to demand answers about what was happening to Spain's railway infrastructure. The union pointed out that they had been raising concerns for months, that drivers and maintenance crews had been reporting problems that seemed to be getting ignored, and now, within the space of 48 hours, 2 separate crashes had claimed lives on a railway network that was supposed to be one of the safest in Europe. Spain has the second longest high-speed rail network in the world, after China, and for decades it has been held up as an example of how to do rail infrastructure properly, with modern equipment, rigorous safety standards, and massive investment in keeping everything maintained to the highest levels. But when you start digging into the details of what has been happening on the Madrid to Andalusia corridor over the past few years, a different picture starts to emerge. Since 2022, there have been at least 18 reported incidents on these tracks, ranging from signaling failures to problems with the overhead power lines, and the high-speed services between Madrid and the south have become notorious for delays and disruptions. Some of this is down to cable theft, which is a persistent problem on routes that cross large stretches of sparsely populated countryside, but some of it points to deeper issues with how the infrastructure is being maintained as traffic volumes have increased with the arrival of new private operators competing for passengers. The investigation into Adamuz is still ongoing, and the 40-centimeter rail break at the defective weld remains a working hypothesis rather than a confirmed conclusion. But the forensic evidence on the wheels of the surviving carriages tells a story that is hard to argue with, because only the right side wheels showed damage consistent with hitting what investigators described as a cliff in the rail surface, and the pattern of marks suggested that the weight of the first wheel set temporarily pushed the broken section down, giving the second wheel set just 30 milliseconds of clearance before the rail sprang back up. 30 milliseconds, roughly the time it takes you to blink, and that was the margin between the front of the train passing safely and the rear carriages catching the edge of that break and tearing themselves off the rails. 46 lives lost on a straight piece of track that had been renovated 8 months earlier, tested 3 times in the months before the crash, and flagged by drivers as problematic 5 months before it all went wrong. The Spanish rail network will eventually get to the bottom of what happened at Adamuz, and there will be reports and recommendations, and probably some changes to how welds are inspected and monitored. But right now, somewhere out there are other stretches of track carrying thousands of passengers every day, and the people driving those trains are the ones who know whether something feels wrong, whether the rails are smooth, or whether there are bumps and vibrations that should not be there. The question that keeps coming back is simple enough. When they raise the alarm, is anyone actually listening?